Hi.
Hi,
Oh, it's working.
how are you? I know
I'm
it's always
so,
amazing, isn't it?
yes.
Just remind me again. Now, do you have a salon in Denver? No. Tell
No,
me sort
I
of.
I cannot take credit for wanting to do anybody's hair but my own. And then I cut mine off, so I don't even want to do that.
Gotcha.
But no, I actually have friends who are stylists. However, my nonprofit is Curls on the Block, and basically, there's a huge gap in girls' engagement in STEM and STEAM. One, because of representation, and as an educator, I was a teacher for 7 years, so a special education teacher at that, and so I really saw the learners who were struggling the most in our education system, and
Hmm.
they didn't have a voice. I was always advocating, getting in trouble, and I finally just decided to focus on the nonprofit that I had created. And what I had started with was just like an after school thing at an all girls school. And I created like special invitations for the girls, and it was called Curly Girls Rock, because there was only about 20 black girls at the school, or 25 to 25, well, however you identify, whatever. I don't know
Hmm.
how they all identify, but girls with curly hair were in the minority at this school, and a lot of them didn't really know what to do with that. And middle school is just awkward, so
Right.
I can attest to that. In fact, that's kind of like my story. I use my horrible experience with a relaxer, and as kind of like my premise. But anyway, we started, and I had 2.5 hours with the girls, and I had like 10 parents. I had community folks come, and we got to talk about bad hair days. We talked about breaking combs in our hair. We talked about just even one of the things that really stuck out for me was the question I had them like do clickers on was, if you've got a great outfit on, but your hair's not done, do you still feel good? And actually, even adults did it, and they're like, nope. So if you have a bad hair day, that's really detrimental to your self-esteem and how you're
Right.
navigating the world just in general, from youth to adulthood.
Ready to answer whatever questions you may
Okay,
have.
let me get this.
Excellent. Okay.
Well, and full disclosure, it's really been interesting learning which one of my friends actually know, more Black history as well, and
Right.
the hair care side of things. So a guy who I just met, he was like, yeah, I know Madam CJ Walker. That's so cool. And he was like, isn't there a Netflix series coming? I was like, okay, you get a little point there.
Right.
I was like,
Right. Right.
I can see you know how to
So yeah,
Google.
by this time next year, well, I think it's sometime between Thanksgiving and Christmas is when the Netflix series will air. They're trying to figure out the exact date, but
Yeah.
that will just take it to the next level. So I'm
Oh,
very excited.
well, and I hope that we could be a part of it over here in Denver. So whatever I can do to support, I'm down to be feet on the
I
ground.
really appreciate it. I'm trying to get the producer folks to focus on. There's so many people who want to be helpful, and I'm trying to get them to focus on that. And they're telling me, it's too early. It's too early. I'm like, yeah, but if I don't tell you, if I don't, start making these lists now, then it'll be too late. So let's,
Well,
pay attention.
whatever you need, I'm down. I can get a location. We can stream it, whatever. And yeah, people are pretty
That's
excited.
great. So the whole idea of streaming parties. Well, I appreciate that, and I will make sure that once I have some kind of plan from these folks who do the planning.
Yeah. Well, you know what? We could even start there with, maybe not how you got to the docu-series, but
Hmm.
your interest in, like, how did you know you were related to uh, Maverick? And you know that.
Yes, well, you know, I would say that I grew up in a household where both of my parents worked in the hair care business. My mom was worked at the Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company, which had been founded by her great grandmother in 1906. And after my parents were married, my father worked for the Walker Company for a few years, and then he was actually hired away to become president of another Black hair care company called Summit Laboratories. And we know that from 1906 until the 1950s, the Walker Company was really one of the premier Black hair care companies. But in the late 50s, companies like Summit Labs and Soft Sheen and Johnson Products were starting to develop chemical hair straighteners. And my dad was hired by one of those companies. So they were disrupting the market. We talk about disruption now. So they disrupted the old way of doing hair.
Yeah.
But as a child, my mom went to work every day at the Madam Walker Company. I would go with her to her office, and she had an adding machine and a typewriter before computers and calculators. And the ladies were hand filling the jars in the factory. So I have that memory. The silverware that we used every day had Madam Walker's monogram, and our china for special occasions had belonged to Madam Walker. And the baby grand piano in our living room had been Madam Walker's daughter's piano, Alelia Walker's piano, and a lot of famous Harlem Renaissance people had played that piano. And that's where I learned to read music on that piano. So I had these artifacts and stories about these famous women in my family. But my mother was very wise about not making it too big a deal so that, we wouldn't be overwhelmed by it, that we had to come to it on our own. And so that was, it was like, that was interesting, but you need to follow your own path and your own passion. My interest was being a writer. I worked on my junior high newspaper and high school newspaper and ended up working in television. But when I was in graduate school at Columbia, the journalism school, my advisor was a woman named Phyllis Garland, the only Black woman on the faculty. And Phyllis recognized my name, Alelia, as being connected to Madam Walker. And I wasn't walking around going, I'm related to Madam Walker. That was just like, okay, that's one of the things, but it's not like my whole identity. And Phil, I was writing my master's paper, and she asked me about topics. I gave her some lame topics. And at the end of the conversation, she said, "Your name is Alelia. Do you have any connection to Madam Walker and Alelia Walker?" And I'm pretty sure Phil knew the answer because her mother had been an editor of a Black newspaper called the Pittsburgh Courier. Oh, wow. But she let me answer. When I said yes, she said, "That's what you're going to write your paper about." That was in 1975, at a time when very few people were saying Madam Walker is important, that, Black women need books written about them. But Phil validated that for me at a very critical time. So that's how I started on this journey of writing about these women in my family. And now I've been doing that for more than 4 decades. And it has resulted in 4 books. I'm almost finished with the 5th, a Netflix series, and all kinds of other things. But I think what's most important to me is that Madam Walker's story still inspires another generation. So I'm really fortunate to be able to be the one to tell that story.
I'm glad you are. And because I was like, man, that's actually a really huge endeavor to even start unfolding your own family history too, because, records are sometimes not always accurate.
Yeah. Well, and with Madam Walker, I think that for a really long time, I think a lot of what we knew about women's history and Black history and the history of people of color in America was really intentionally buried. That our history books did not include us. And certainly my history books in high school didn't. Now kids get a lot more, and there's a lot more on the internet. They can discover things. But I think that deleting our history, erasing our history, meant that we did not have a claim on having made any contributions in America, which is, of course, a lie.
Right.
But we now are telling these stories. And I think what most people knew about Madam Walker, and many people still do, they know, oh, she's the lady who has something to do with hair. And what I was so excited to find out is that, yes, in fact, she was a pioneer of the modern hair care industry. She revolutionized the way Black women did hygiene and cleaned their hair and cared for their hair and conditioned their hair. But she also used the money that she made as she was becoming a millionaire, to be a philanthropist, to be a patron of the arts, to contribute to the anti-lynching movement. I kind of see her as Black Lives Matter 1.0 because she used her money to make a difference. So I loved finding all these dimensions of Madam C.J. Walker, from being born on a plantation in Delta, Louisiana in 1867, being a poor washerwoman, founding a business, employing thousands of women. And by the time she died in 1919, when she was 51 years old, she was a millionaire who helped other people.
I think that's really important too, the element of the philanthropy, because it seems like, well, I'll just own it, my generation, I don't know, we have some people who are, yes, we're so committed, including myself and, you know, others who I know, but I also feel like there's some animosity, and I think in certain communities they're like, oh nope, I did this on my own, or Black people aren't grateful, or Black people don't, that we keep helping, and it's like, okay, excuse me, someone had to help you, and someone had to
Thank
help
you.
so I was really excited to hear, and when I was reading up, I'm like, these women were amazing. Starting your own school, like, we're trying to figure out how to do that out here in Denver. We can't even start up some stuff. You know, people always complain, and who's really getting on the ground and doing it? But the fact that most people don't even know it has been done, like, no, we did control our narrative.
Right.
Well, for a while, at least. Didn't even realize you're creating a narrative, but you did control your community. And I think that's really, really important and vital for the upcoming generation who's younger than me to know, hey, we have people who've done these things before. You're not alone in this. And even if you are the first, okay, there's other women you can look at who are also the first, and don't get deterred. Now, I do have kind of a funny question about partners and Black women. Now, from my research, minimal, we had, you know, women were getting married a few times. So what do you think about Black relationships, you know, from back then, and Black women really who were empowered and making money, and versus now? Do you see a correlation? Are we doing the same thing? Is it okay? Like, what are you thinking?
Well, you know, I do think that it is hard sometimes for women to, you know, own the fact that they want to be economically independent and that they want to have their own money. That people will, you need to, go on.
No, it's a friend who knows what I'm doing.
Oh, okay.
I was like, I don't know, I can't talk.
Right. Yeah, but no, you know, I think that in general, that, you know, that America still has a lot of sexism, a lot of patriarchy.
Yeah.
You know, that's just real. But women have to take care of themselves, and I think Madam Walker was very much an example of that. She had to take care of herself, and it doesn't mean that you can't have, you know, friendships, partnerships, marriages, close relationships with men. You know, if and or you know, whatever your partner may be, that you can be financially successful and be in committed, you know, productive relationships. But that should not be a deterrent for people. That they're successful, that doesn't mean that you have to put your light under a bushel.
Right.
And in Madam Walker's case, here was her situation. She was born Sarah Breedlove, and very poor on a plantation in Louisiana. By the time she was 7, both of her parents had died. She had to move in with an older sister. The sister had a husband who was, Sarah Breedlove always said, was very cruel. He was so cruel, she said, that she got married at 14 to get a home of her own. Then she had her only daughter at 17. Her first husband, Moses McWilliams, died when she was 20. She moved up the river to St. Louis, where she had older brothers who were barbers. They helped her out a little bit, but she was still a poor washerwoman. She married a man named John Davis, who was a drunk and who ran around on her, and who, you know, she thought she was, you know, as they say, I can do bad by myself. Well, she thought she could do better with him. She couldn't. You know, they went their separate ways. She eventually married Charles Joseph Walker, who seemed to have the same level of ambition that she did. But she said, when I began to make $10 a week, he thought that was enough. And I knew that I had a vision for something larger than that. And due to his narrowness of vision, we parted ways.
Gotcha.
Well, you know, so that happens sometimes. She had a bigger dream than her partner's dream.
Yeah.
And she wanted to do something that would have a bigger impact. So I think that we still struggle with that. I think there are many men who are evolved, who understand that, there are, that if you're really successful, that doesn't mean they're unsuccessful. They shouldn't compare themselves in that way, that
Right.
we can do this together. And maybe there are different seasons where one person may be, more financially successful than the other, but that doesn't mean you can't be contributing as a partner. So
Right.
that takes some evolution
Oh,
for
Lord.
people to be able to understand that.
And we're in 2018.
Yeah, I think this, the status quo is very, very hard to challenge.
It is.
And when you see people who, they still don't get sexual harassment, and they still, think, well, I mean, it's just, it really stuns me at this stage in my life that we are still fighting the same battles. But I think that's, you just have to, you have to have confidence in yourself and realize that your vision is that there are going to be some people who are going to come along with you and some who are not.
And one of the things I thought, the reason I also was thinking about that is how important it is to recognize she actually took on his name.
Right.
So obviously, he was really impactful and influential, and I was like, that's so genius because
and they got married in Denver. So of course she moved to Denver in July of 1905. And because she was really trying to get away from the John Davis, the other guy. But she had met Charles Joseph Walker in St. Louis. He worked for a black newspaper and sold advertisements. So that was really, for somebody like her, she was trying to start a business with hair care, and he knew how to make advertisements. So they had skills that were complementary to each other. After she moved to Denver, she joined Shorter AME Church. Her sister-in-law, who was widowed, was living in Denver and was a member of Shorter. She had 4 daughters, and the daughters could help Sarah mix her products up. She had sent her daughter to Knoxville College at that point. So now she's trying to have a fresh start from the second husband. Right. And now her good friend, Charles Joseph Walker, moves to Denver in, I think, December of 1905, and then they get married in early 1906. And you can see her ads in the Denver Statesman, which was the black newspaper. Mm-hmm. First, she was Sarah McWilliams. She left off Davis, the second husband, Sarah McWilliams, the first husband. Mm-hmm. And then after she and Charles Joseph Walker got married, there's an ad that says Mrs. C.J. Walker. And then a few weeks later, she begins to call herself Madam C.J. Walker. And so that when you think that was a little bit of an affectation, because Paris was the center of fashion and beauty. So you would add Madam, but also women who had businesses, like if they were a seamstress or a caterer, in old ads, you would see Madam Jones or Madam Smith. So that was her way of trying to create some dignity and respect. Mm-hmm. In part so white people wouldn't call her by her first name. They didn't know what her first name was. Mm-hmm. So she's Madam CJ to you.
Mm-hmm. I know, right? It's kind of like I have a cousin whose name is Sir Billion, and then, or King, or, we have these really intentional names now. Yeah, you're going to call my kid a King. So mm-hmm. I just thought that was ingenious, and I'm glad you were able to highlight that. That's always
well, there's something, I think there's, personal transformation is very important, because you think of a person who's born on a plantation, no real formal education, has no real skills. How does she transform herself? And there are certain steps along the way. First, she had to have that resilience to just get out of a bad situation. Yeah. Then after she was widowed, she had to have the courage to leave Louisiana and move to St. Louis. But once she got to St. Louis and she joined St. Paul AME in St. Louis, the AME church is very important throughout her life, but she joined St. Paul AME. She's 20 some years old, poor, uneducated, but it's the women of the church who really begin to give her a vision of herself. In the same way that you're working with young girls, they could see that she wanted to do better. And so they made sure that her daughter was enrolled in kindergarten. They helped her begin to learn to read and write, to start taking some, essentially literacy classes. Mm-hmm. Her mentor was a school teacher who later became the principal of her school in St. Louis. But there were people who helped her along the way. Everybody needs help, and she had mentors who helped push her along.
That's awesome. And I'm grateful for you mentioning that too, because there is a question out there now. Even in my digging, I actually didn't know 100%. I knew that the hair care industry was framed by her work for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I feel like we still see that structure now. I don't know how you feel, but I definitely am like, actually, all these brand ambassadors, even YouTube, it's just like this spin with technology teaching you how to manage your hair.
Right.
Like, man, what happened in between that? We had this and now, but I think it's just transformed with learning even the curly maintenance and no extra other chemicals, but knowing both, that's fine. Just
right. Yeah, it's good to know both. Right.
But as far as mentors, is there anyone in particular? Because I have heard of Annie Malone.
Annie Malone. So, right. Yeah, so so that's just a sort of like, let me sort of untangle that story for you. there is a guy who's trying to sell some books and who's called Madam Walker. Said Annie Malone was Madam Walker's mentor.
Right.
So and I'm going to tell you that relationship, but I really don't consider Annie Malone Madam Walker's mentor.
Gotcha.
I think her real mentor is a woman named Jessie Batts Robinson, who was a school teacher in St. Louis, the woman who later became the principal of her beauty school, who was also a member of St. Paul AME Church and who was very involved in a leadership role in a women's auxiliary for a Black men's sort of fraternal organization. Jessie Batts Robinson was an educated woman who helped to mentor Sarah Breedlove McWilliams and who helped to educate her. So that's her mentor. When I consider what I think a mentor relationship is somebody with whom you have a really close relationship, who really helps you and who, pushes you to the next level.
Yeah.
Now, the story with Malone, when Sarah Breedlove was really struggling, her brothers were barbers in St. Louis. So that means she had some exposure to hair care.
Right.
There were products already on the market like Cuticura that was, basically a shampoo and an ointment with sulfur. And this formula for healing scalp disease had been around for really centuries. You can find these formulas in old medical and pharmaceutical books. Mm-hmm. At a time when most Americans didn't have indoor plumbing, people didn't bathe very often. Mm-hmm. They only washed their hair sometimes once a month, sometimes not at all during the winter. So a lot of women were going bald. Wow. And Sarah Breedlove was one of those women. She had really horrible scalp infections. And she was trying to figure out ways to, heal the scalp infections. So she did go to work for about a year as a sales agent for Annie Malone. She met her in St. Louis. They lived really near each other. She sold Malone's products. When she moved from St. Louis to Denver, for the first few months while she was in Denver, she was selling Malone's products. I don't know exactly what happened, but there seems to have been some kind of dispute between them. I don't know if the products were arriving on time. I don't know if they had a difference of the ways that they did business. Mm-hmm. But Sarah Breedlove started selling her own products. And there are a couple of ways that I think that happened. Mm-hmm. When she moved to Denver, her main job was being a cook for E.O. Schultz, who had the largest pharmacy west of the Mississippi in 5 Points.
Oh, wow.
She was his cook. And there is a woman whose mother was a friend of hers during that period of time, who I interviewed years later. And she said that the pharmacist, E.O. Schultz, saw that she was selling products on the side. And he said, what is this? And he immediately recognized that this was a formula that really was being sold under other labels that was very similar, like Cuticura. And he said, you can mix up your own formula, because she did that. He helped her mix that up. And I think she tweaked it a little bit. When I look at what is supposed to have been the original formula for Annie Malone and what Madam Walker's formula is, there are a few ingredients that are a little bit different. And so absolutely, Madam Walker sold Annie Malone's products, and that was very helpful to her. But it was one of many things that were helpful to her. And what I also think is that as she's selling these products, she begins to discover the product. Yes, it's wash your hair more often, apply an ointment with sulfur, heal the dandruff. That's important. But what she realized is that she had a great deal of charisma and the ability to teach other people and to mentor other people. And I think her genius is that she was a great teacher and she was a great marketer, and she was a great motivator. So the product, there were several people who had similar products. Mm-hmm. There were some people who were master salespeople. And so I think that is where Madam Walker comes into play. So yes, Annie Malone plays a role. I think Jessie Batts Robinson is her mentor when you consider what a mentor should be as opposed to a transactional relationship. Right. And so it's very much a part of the story. And then you see, as time goes on, how Madam Walker develops and how Annie Malone develops. And there are various places along that route where you see that Madam Walker made sure she surrounded herself with great professionals and people who could keep her business together. Where Annie Malone was an extremely successful person and a very generous person, but made a few missteps. She married a guy who really kind of sabotaged her business. She made some decisions that probably did not help her. And the companies, they were sort of amazing women. And, one sort of did one set of decisions and one did another set of decisions.
I think that speaks volume. And to be honest, I had looked at different sources on, why the language and terminology people use. I was it made a lot of sense. Okay, so she was hired by one person and then realized, I can do this too and better. So, and that happens a lot. I think that's like everyone's worst nightmare. That's like Facebook's worst nightmare with Instagram and all that. But there's
and you take it to the next level. And I will just sort of clear up one thing, because now you'll say, well, no, Annie Malone was really the first millionaire. So here's like where I come out on that. I think it's very hard to document any, women and people of color because the records are often spotty. But what I can say about this is that with Madam Walker, because she did hire a great accountant, a great lawyer, great managers, that we have records, and those records were preserved. And so when she died, we know we have those records with sales. We know what her taxes were. We know what the value of her estate was. We know the value of her company. And I can say with confidence that when Madam Walker died in 1919, she was a millionaire. Because of some of Malone's other decisions, there are very, very few records, so they can't really document that. So, I want them to, Annie Malone is really interesting. I want them to find whatever they can find, but, they got to document it.
Right. And I appreciate your candidness with that, just because obviously when I started digging, I actually didn't know until this year. So I'm like, oh, really? Excuse me?
Yeah, and they're both really important people.
And you know what? Actually, when this most recent election with a lot of the congresswomen, how they're able to say it's okay to have two firsts at the same time. It's still important. It's still right. Our story, and it means, we can do it too.
Right. But the fact that people are still like fighting about like who, I was like, stop.
Yeah, right, because you're not getting none of that money either way. So I just found that interesting.
Right. But that's just so competition is competition.
Actually, I wanted to know even your perspective on definitely this current movement. Obviously, I'm sure you're familiar with the new product line. How are you feeling about it? And
I love it. I love it. I mean, so because I grew up in the hair care industry, I have maybe a little different perspective than a lot of people because I've watched the cycles that it's gone through. So it was the Walker Company, Poro, Apex. Those were sort of the big three founded by Black women. And And people were, those were the prestige lines, and people wanted to say that they used one of those when in fact they were buying Royal Crown because it was
That clear in the red tint. It's
exactly. But they were like they wanted to have Madam Walker, but it was $1.10, and the Royal Crown might be 15 cents.
Right.
So people find the less expensive thing. But I watched that because I've done a lot of history, knowing products for Black women were around in the 1800s. Yeah. They were advertised in Black newspapers. And then these three companies, Walker, Apex, Poro, were the premier prestige lines for Black women. People aspired to use them, even if they were buying a cheaper product like Royal Crown or something like that. And then we get into this, the late 50s and the early 60s is when chemical hair straighteners are starting to be mass marketed, and they're safer than some of the old-fashioned lines. So women were perming their hair. And then we get into the late 60s when the afros, first emerges in a massive way. Exactly. And, many people really wanted to have natural hair. And then the pendulum swings back and forth. A more conservative political era, people felt like they couldn't get jobs. They couldn't be hired if they didn't have their hair straightened. So we went through that phase. And then we began, I think, in the 90s, in the early 2000s, where a lot more people began to wear their hair natural. But there also was a revolution in the formulas for the products. Right. Now there were products that were actually being made that would address our need for moisture. So for my generation, we all wore, big Angela Davis afro, and that was the style, or it was either really big or it was really short. Right. But now there are all of the other options because we can style our hair with the products that have been developed. And so now I think there's much more versatility. There are all of these product lines. It's exciting to me that Stacey Abrams, who ran for governor of Georgia, wears her hair natural. So I think we are in a new era. I'm very excited about the Madam C.J. Walker Beauty Culture line. The company had been owned by members of my family and another family, the Ransoms, into the mid 80s. It was the trademark was purchased by another entity who owned it for about 30 years, but didn't really develop it in a competitive way. But about 6 or 7 years ago, Richelieu Dennis purchased the line. He is the founder of Sundial Brands, now the owner of Essence. But Richelieu grew up in Liberia, but he knew about Madam Walker and always wondered what had happened to the line. So he bought the trademark. And after he owned the trademark, he reached out to me along with another gentleman, Lance Clark, who used to be head of fashion fair for Johnson. And we had lunch and a really great conversation. And I was just so impressed with Richelieu that I could see that he was a visionary. And when he began to develop this line with members of his family and his research and development team, I could see that they were doing it in everything was first class, high quality, everything. So I'm the brand historian for this line, and I love it. I love that they had the respect to bring it back. So now I feel like the seeds that have been planted all my life, from watching my mother go to work at the Walker Company, from my dad being president of a successful hair care company, of me following my own passion to be a writer, all of those things came together. And my years in network television news meant I understood how to tell a story. And then to bring it forward, and now to be almost finished with my 5th book, to have a Netflix series coming, to have this product line, and then 2 National Historic Landmarks, the Madam Walker Legacy Center in Indianapolis and Villa Lawaro, Madam Walker's mansion in Irvington, that this is Madam Walker's moment. Next year will be the 100th anniversary of her death.
Oh my God.
This year is the 150th anniversary of her birth. So we have, it's a really great time to tell her story, but to tell her story in a way that I hope inspires other people.
I'm excited. I can't, and okay, so I'm a little bit of a creeper for sure. I'm like always online trying to find stuff. And actually, it's so crazy. This year has been amazing. I'm just thinking back right now. I was at Texture on the Runway, and that is, I got an invite to go out there. So I booked my flight and I was like, I'm just going to go. So I was by myself. But I had also attended Urban League's convention this year too. And these things are connected because I got a chance to take some photos with Richelieu.
Oh, did you? Oh,
Yes,
great.
yeah. And
Great. He's wonderful.
Man, an amazing spirit, and he very approachable and was willing to take a selfie. So
Yes.
definitely shout, post that, hey, look at all these things that are connecting for me as well. So
yeah. I feel so fortunate that this is where it's ended up, because I will tell you, there are really wonderful things that are happening now, but there are ups and downs. I mean, I don't think any of us get to our goals without, some disappointments, some setbacks, some haters, some legal stuff, the whole thing. But I'm really, I feel very grateful right now.
Thank you again for your time, and
all right.
I look forward to the package, but also being able to send you some curly gear too.
Excellent. Well, I'll send you my address when I get yours.
Okay. Well, have a great day.
Great. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.